The kitchen at Cross Ranch smelled like lard and coffee grounds before the sun touched the horizon. Clara Whitlock moved through the dark like she'd done it 1,000 times before, because she had. Her hands knew where the cast iron sat without looking. Her feet avoided the loose board by the stove that creaked loud enough to wake the bunkhouse. She'd learned every sound this kitchen made, every shadow it threw, every way to move through it without being noticed. Being noticed got you hurt. She was 24 years old and looked 40 in the wrong light. The kind of worn that came from the inside out, like a creek bed that had run dry too many seasons in a row. Her hair, dark brown and pulled back tight, showed threads of gray she didn't have 2 years ago. Her hands were raw from lye soap and hot water, knuckles cracked despite the bacon grease she rubbed into them at night. The bruise on her left ribs was 4 days old, purple, turning yellow at the edges. She'd wrapped it herself with strips torn from a flour sack, because doctors asked questions and questions led to James coming home drunk and angry about being embarrassed. James Whitlock, her husband, the man who'd promised her father he'd provide for her, protect her, give her a good Christian home. That was 6 years ago in a church in Missouri. She'd been 18 and stupid enough to think a man who smiled in front of preachers was a man who smiled at home. Clara struck a match and lit the stove. The flame caught and spread across the kindling she'd prepared the night before. Everything in this kitchen was prepared the night before. Bacon sliced and waiting in the cold box. Biscuit dough already cut and resting under a damp cloth. Coffee measured out in the big tin pot that could brew enough for 15 ranch hands and still have some left for the foreman. The ranch hands would start filtering in around 5:30. The foreman, Miguel Santos, usually arrived first. He'd nod at her, pour his own coffee, and sit in the corner reading week-old newspapers until the others showed up. Miguel never talked much, but he'd helped her carry a 100-pound sack of flour once when James was supposed to do it and didn't. Never mentioned it afterward. Never asked about the fingerprint bruises on her upper arm that appeared a few days later when James found out another man had touched his wife's workload. She laid bacon strips across the griddle. They hissed and spat grease. The sound filled the kitchen, familiar and almost comforting in its predictability. The door to the small room off the kitchen where she and James slept remained closed. He was still asleep. He'd been out late gambling with some of the hands, came back after midnight reeking of whiskey and cigars, shoved her against the wall hard enough to knock a plate off the shelf, then passed out face down on the bed, still wearing his boots. She'd taken the boots off, not because she cared, but because if he woke up with them still on, he'd accuse her of being a lazy wife who couldn't even tend to her husband proper. You learned to think 3 steps ahead when you lived like this. Learned to predict moods, anticipate anger, redirect blame before it found you. It was exhausting, like being a rabbit that never stopped listening for wolves. Clara flipped the bacon. Her fingers moved quick, practiced. She'd been cooking for the Cross Ranch for almost a year now, ever since Ethan Cross bought out the previous owner and needed someone to feed his crew. James had volunteered her services without asking, showed up at the main house with her in tow, said his wife was the best cook in Red Hollow, and would work for fair wages. What he meant was he'd found a way to keep her where he could see her while pocketing most of her pay. Ethan Cross had looked at her that day, really looked, not through her the way most men did, and asked if she wanted the job. James answered for her. Ethan kept looking at her until she nodded. "I'd like to hear it from her," Ethan had said. James's hand had tightened on her shoulder. Warning. "Yes, sir," Clara had whispered. "I'd be grateful for the work." Ethan hired her on the spot, told James the wages would be paid directly to Clara every week. James had smiled and agreed because you didn't argue with Ethan Cross if you wanted to keep working in Red Hollow. Then Ethan told James he expected workers to show up sober and on time, and if that wasn't going to happen, there were plenty of other men looking for ranch work. James hadn't smiled at that, but he'd shown up sober for 3 whole weeks after. That was something. The bacon finished. Clara transferred it to a platter and set it in the warming box above the stove. She started cracking eggs into a bowl, 2 dozen of them for scrambling. The shells went into a bucket for the chickens. Nothing got wasted out here. The sun was starting to rise now. Gray light crept through the kitchen window, turning everything soft and colorless before the real morning arrived. Clara glanced out that window without meaning to, just a habit, just checking. Ethan Cross stood in the yard. Her hand stopped moving. An egg hung suspended over the bowl, forgotten. He was looking right at her. Not at the kitchen, not at the window in general. At her. Their eyes met across 30 yards of dirt and morning shadow, and something passed between them that Clara couldn't name. Wasn't attraction, nothing that simple or dangerous. It was recognition, maybe. The way you'd recognize another person who'd been held underwater and survived it. Ethan didn't look away. Didn't pretend he hadn't been staring. He just stood there in his work clothes and worn leather vest, hat in his hands, looking at her like she was a problem he was trying to figure out how to solve. Then his eyes dropped, not to avoid her gaze, but to track down her frame, slow and deliberate. She knew what he saw. The way she held her left arm close to her ribs, the careful way she moved, the sleeve that didn't quite cover the green-yellow edge of an old bruise on her wrist. When his eyes came back to hers, something had changed in them. He put his hat on, nodded once, turned and walked toward the barn. Claire realized she was holding her breath. The egg in her hand had cracked, and yolk was dripping through her fingers into the bowl. She set it down and wiped her hand on her apron, heart doing something irregular in her chest. Nobody saw her. That was the whole point of how she lived. You stayed small, stayed quiet, stayed invisible, and maybe you'd get through the day without new damage. But Ethan Cross had just looked at her like she was visible, like she mattered, like what was happening to her was wrong, and he knew it. That was more dangerous than any of James's fists. The kitchen door banged open and Clara jumped, whirling around so fast the egg bowl nearly tipped. "Coffee ready?" Miguel Santos stood in the doorway, newspaper under his arm, expression carefully neutral. But his eyes flicked to her hands, still shaking slightly, and then to the closed door of her room where James slept. "Almost," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 2 minutes. Miguel nodded and took his usual seat in the corner. He didn't pour his own coffee this time, just sat there, quiet and watchful, like a guard dog that had positioned itself between the sheep and the woods. Clara finished the eggs, got the biscuits in the oven, poured Miguel his coffee, and set it in front of him without a word. "Thank you, Senora Whitlock," he said softly. She nodded and went back to the stove. The other hands started trickling in. Young Tommy Bedford, who couldn't grow a beard to save his life but could rope a steer faster than anyone on the ranch. Old Jacob, who'd been cowboying since before Clara was born and had a wife buried in 3 different territories. Marcus and John, the brothers from Kentucky who sang while they worked and argued about everything else. William, the quiet one who read books in the bunkhouse and made the others uncomfortable with words they didn't understand. They filed in, poured coffee, sat down at the long table scarred with knife marks and tobacco burns. They talked about the day's work, which cattle needed moving, which fence line needed mending, whether it was going to rain. They didn't talk about the woman who cooked their food, didn't acknowledge her except to nod thanks when she set platters in front of them. That was normal, that was safe. Then Ethan walked in. The conversation didn't stop exactly, but it changed texture, got more focused. The hands sat up straighter, stopped cussing, paid attention. Ethan Cross was 36 years old and looked like he'd earned every year of it the hard way. Tall, lean in the way that came from work instead of hunger, with the dark hair going gray at the temples and lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. He'd bought this ranch 8 months ago with money nobody knew the source of, hired a crew, and started building something that looked like it might actually last. He ran the place fair, which meant he ran it hard, expected a full day's work for a full day's pay, didn't tolerate stealing, didn't tolerate laziness, and didn't tolerate men who hurt things weaker than themselves, horses, dogs, or otherwise. That last part was something everyone knew, but nobody talked about directly. Ethan poured himself coffee and stood at the head of the table, looking at his crew. "We're moving the herd out of the south pasture today. Grass is getting thin and I want them on higher ground before the weather turns. Miguel, you'll take point. Tommy, Marcus, John, you're with him. Jacob, I need you and William to finish that fence line on the eastern border. I'll be in town until noon dealing with the bank, then I'll join you." The men nodded and went back to eating. Ethan's eyes moved across the room and landed on Clara. She was pulling biscuits out of the oven, back turned to the table, but she felt his gaze like heat on her shoulders. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. She turned. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" I'll need to speak with you before I leave for town, after breakfast. Every man at the table went still. Not obvious. They kept chewing, kept moving, but the quality of their attention shifted, because ranch owners didn't ask to speak privately with other men's wives unless something was wrong. "Yes, sir," Clara said quietly. James chose that moment to shove open the bedroom door. He looked like hell warmed over. Shirt untucked, hair standing up, eyes bloodshot and mean. He took in the scene, his wife at the stove, Ethan Cross standing in the middle of his kitchen, all the ranch hands eating breakfast, and his expression went dark. "The hell's going on here?" James said. "Breakfast," Ethan replied calmly. "Same as every morning. I'm talking about you standing in my house giving orders to my wife." "This is the ranch kitchen," Ethan said. His voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened. "Which makes it part of my property. Your wife works for me. I was informing her I need to discuss ranch business." James's jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. He looked at Clara. "You got something to say to him? You say it now. I don't want you alone with any man, boss or not." "James," Clara started. "I don't recall asking your permission," Ethan cut in. "I'm telling you as a courtesy because you're her husband and you work on my land. But make no mistake, how I run my ranch and who I speak to about ranch business isn't subject to your approval." The kitchen went so quiet you could hear the coffee pot bubbling on the stove. James took a step forward. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could bend horseshoes. He'd used those hands on Clara enough times that she'd learned to read the specific way his fingers curled before they became fists. They were curling now. "You think you can talk to me like that in front of these men?" James said softly. "You think I'm going to stand here and let you disrespect me?" "I think you're going to back up and calm down," Ethan said. "Or you're going to find yourself looking for work somewhere else. You'd fire me over this?" "I'd fire you for insubordination, for showing up to my kitchen drunk and hostile, for making a scene in front of my crew." Ethan's eyes were flat and cold. "Pick whichever reason you like best." James breathed hard through his nose. Clara could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Pride versus money, anger versus survival. He wasn't smart, but he was smart enough to know he needed this job. Red Hollow didn't have many ranches, and the ones that existed didn't hire men with reputations for being difficult. "Fine," James bit out. "You want to talk to my wife about ranch business? You talk to her, but I'm going to be right outside that door, and if I hear anything I don't like—" "You'll do nothing," Ethan finished, "because if you threaten me or her again, you'll be off this ranch before sundown. Are we clear?" Another long, terrible silence. "Clear," James finally said. He grabbed a biscuit off the platter, shoved it in his mouth, and stormed out the back door. It slammed hard enough to rattle the dishes. Clara stood frozen by the stove, hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. She could feel every man in that room not looking at her, could feel their careful attention on their plates and coffee cups. Ethan turned to his crew. "Finish eating and get to work. I want that herd moved before the heat sets in." They ate faster. Nobody spoke. Within 5 minutes, the kitchen was empty except for Clara and Ethan. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, gestured to the seat across from him. "Please," he said. Clara's legs felt shaky, but she sat, folded her hands in her lap and waited. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "How long?" She didn't pretend not to understand. 6 years. "Has it gotten worse?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Does he hit you when he's sober?" "Sometimes." "Does he hit you where it doesn't show?" "Mostly." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something moved in his eyes, something old and angry and tired. "I can't make him stop, Clara, not directly. A man's marriage is his own business, legally speaking, and if you're not willing to testify against him, there's nothing the law will do." "I'm not," she said quickly, too quickly. "I know, and I understand why." He leaned forward slightly. "But here's what I can do. On my land, under my roof, you are under my protection. If he raises a hand to you anywhere on this ranch, in this kitchen, in that room, anywhere, I will remove him. I will end his employment, and I will make sure every rancher in 3 territories knows why. Do you understand?" Clara stared at him. "He'll kill me." Not on my land, he won't. He'll take me away from here. He'll say we're moving. You can't stop that. Can't I? Ethan's voice was soft, almost gentle. You're my employee, Clara. I pay your wages directly to you. If you want to leave, that's your choice. But if I believe you're being coerced or taken against your will, I have every right to intervene. The law won't see it that way. I'm his wife. The law is what the sheriff decides to enforce, and the sheriff in Red Hollow is a man named Bill Carson, who owes me a significant favor. Ethan stood up. I'm not saying this will be easy. I'm not saying it won't get ugly. But I am saying that if you decide you want out, if you decide you've had enough, and you want a different life, I will help you get there. All you have to do is ask. Clara's throat felt tight. Why? Why what? Why would you do this? You don't know me. I'm nobody. I'm just... You're a person, Ethan said quietly, being hurt by someone who's supposed to protect you. And I've got a particular hatred for men who beat women. Call it a character flaw. He put his hat on and headed for the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. I meant what I said, Clara. You're under my protection now, whether you want it or not. Then he was gone. Clara sat alone in the kitchen, hands still folded in her lap, heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, she could hear James's voice raised in anger, arguing with someone, probably Miguel, who'd likely positioned himself between James and the house. The words were muffled, but the rage came through clear enough. She should be scared. She was scared, but underneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, probably going to get her killed hope. She stood up and started clearing the breakfast dishes. Her hands were steady now. The bruise on her ribs hurt with every breath, but she'd survived worse. And maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to survive alone anymore. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of work. Clara scrubbed dishes, prepped lunch, baked bread for dinner. The familiar routine steadied her, gave her something to focus on besides the memory of Ethan's words and the sound of James's voice outside. Around 10 o'clock, James came back in. He didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway watching her work, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Clara kept her eyes down, kept her hands moving. Don't engage, don't react, don't give him anything to grab onto. Think you're clever? James said finally. She didn't answer. Got the boss man protecting you now. Got him threatening my job over you. Clara scrubbed a plate harder than necessary. Soap suds splashed onto her apron. Look at me when I'm talking to you. She looked, met his eyes for exactly 1 second, then dropped her gaze back to the dishes. It was the wrong move. James crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and grabbed her arm, the left one, right over the old bruise. His fingers dug in hard enough to make her gasp. You think he's going to save you? James's voice was low, almost conversational. You think because he runs this ranch, he's got some kind of power over me? Over us? Let go, Clara said quietly. He can't watch you every second, can't follow us home, can't stop me from taking what's mine. You're hurting me. I'll hurt you worse if you embarrass me again. His grip tightened. You understand? You go to him, cry about how your husband's so mean, try to get me fired. I'll make you regret it. I'll make you wish you'd kept your mouth shut. The kitchen door opened. Miguel Santos stood there with an armful of firewood, face carefully blank. Senora Whitlock asked me to bring more wood for the stove, he said in his quiet, formal way. James's hand dropped from Clara's arm. He stepped back, putting distance between them, rearranging his expression into something almost pleasant. Appreciate that, Miguel, James said. My wife works herself too hard sometimes. Forgets to ask for help. Miguel set the wood down by the stove, looked at Clara. Anything else you need, Senora? It was the question underneath the question. Are you safe? Do you need me to stay? Clara shook her head. No, thank you. This is perfect. Miguel nodded, looked at James for a beat too long, then left. The moment the door closed, James grabbed his coat off the hook. I'm going into town, he said. I'll be back for lunch. And Clara? She waited. You say one word to Cross about this, I'll know, and you won't like what happens after. He left. The door didn't slam this time. Somehow that was worse. The control in it, the certainty that he'd already won whatever game they were playing. Clara stood at the sink staring at the soapy water, watching her reflection fragment and reform in the ripples. Her arm throbbed where he'd grabbed it. There'd be new bruises by tonight, layered over the old ones like a map of all the times she hadn't fought back. She should be used to it by now. 6 years was a long time, long enough to learn that fighting back just made it worse, that silence was safer than screaming, that surviving was the best you could hope for. But Ethan's words kept circling in her head. You're under my protection now, whether you want it or not. What did that even mean? Protection from what? James's fists, his threats, his ownership of her entire existence? How could anyone protect her from the law itself, from a marriage contract that made her property, from a town that would always take a husband's word over a wife's? The bread dough had risen. Clara punched it down with more force than necessary, kneaded it smooth, shaped it into loaves. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while her mind spun in circles. She thought about leaving, just walking out of this kitchen, out of Red Hollow, out of James's life entirely. Start over somewhere new with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever wages she'd managed to hide from him. But where would she go? She had no family. Her parents were dead, her brother had disappeared into California 3 years ago and never wrote. She had no money beyond the few coins she'd squirreled away in a tin can buried behind the henhouse. She had no skills except cooking and cleaning, and any respectable household would want references, would ask about her husband, would send her right back to him. There was no escape. Not really. Unless someone with power decided to help. And that was the truly dangerous part of hope. It made you believe in rescue. Made you think someone might actually care enough to put themselves between you and harm. Made you forget that people looked out for themselves first, and anyone who promised different was either lying or hadn't been tested yet. Clara slid the bread loaves into the oven and wiped her hands on her apron. The kitchen was clean, lunch was prepped. She had an hour before the hands came in for their midday meal. She should rest, should sit down, take the weight off her feet, maybe close her eyes for a few minutes. Instead, she found herself walking to the window, the same window where Ethan had seen her that morning. He was out by the corral now, talking to Tommy about something related to a horse that was favoring its front left leg. Even from here, Clara could see the way Ethan moved, confident but not aggressive, authoritative but not cruel. He put a hand on the horse's neck, spoke to it soft enough that she couldn't hear the words, and the animal calmed under his touch. James would have hit the horse, would have called it stubborn and useless and beaten it until it either obeyed or broke. Ethan just kept talking, kept touching, kept waiting until the horse decided to trust him. Clara pressed her palm against the glass. The window was cool despite the morning sun, and her hand left a print in the dust she hadn't wiped away yet. Maybe that was what protection looked like. Not rescue, not saving, just someone refusing to look away. Someone acknowledging that what was happening was wrong and being willing to say it out loud. That didn't fix anything. Didn't change the fact that she'd go home with James tonight, sleep in the same bed, wake up tomorrow, and do it all again. But it was something. A witness. A line drawn in the dirt. A man with power saying, not here, not on my land, not while I'm watching. It wasn't enough. But maybe it was a start. The bruises bloomed purple-black by evening, finger-shaped and unmistakable. Clara stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bedroom, sleeve rolled up, examining the damage. 5 distinct marks where James's hand had wrapped around her arm that morning. They'd darken more by tomorrow, spread into that sickly green-yellow that took weeks to fade. She'd gotten good at cataloging injuries, knew which ones would heal quick and which ones would linger. Knew how to move so the pain didn't show, how to breathe shallow when her ribs were cracked, how to smile with a split lip without it bleeding again. 6 years of practice made you an expert in your own destruction. Behind her, James sat on the bed, cleaning his rifle. The repetitive sound of the cloth against metal filled the small room, rhythmic, methodical, almost soothing if you didn't know what those hands could do when they weren't occupied. You planning on wearing long sleeves all summer? He asked without looking up. Clara rolled her sleeve back down. I wasn't planning anything. Good, because I don't want Cross getting ideas, seeing marks, asking questions. He won't see anything. He better not. James set the rifle aside and stood. crossed to where she stood by the mirror, put his hands on her shoulders. Not hard, not yet, just heavy with ownership. I've been thinking about what happened this morning. Claire's stomach tightened. James, let me finish. His fingers pressed slightly deeper. I was out of line. Coming in hot like that, making a scene. Cross is right. I need to keep my temper in check, especially at work. She didn't trust this. The apology without anger, the admission of fault. James didn't apologize unless he wanted something or was setting up for something worse. It's fine, she said carefully. It's not fine. I embarrassed you in front of those men, made you look like you can't handle your own husband. His reflection met hers in the mirror. So I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better. All right, but you need to do better too, Clara. There it was. You can't go making me look weak, James continued. Can't go acting like you're scared of me, flinching when I touch you, giving other men reasons to think I'm some kind of brute. I don't. You do. This morning, when Miguel brought that wood, I saw your face, saw how you looked at him like he was rescuing you from something. That makes me look bad, makes people think things that aren't true. Clara turned to face him. Big mistake, should have kept the mirror between them, kept the distance. What do you want me to do, James? I want you to remember who you belong to. Want you to remember that what happens between us is private, between a husband and wife, and nobody else's business. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb resting just below her eye. You're my wife, Clara. Mine. And I take care of what's mine. The thumb pressed slightly harder. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to remind her how easily it could. I know, she whispered. Do you? Because it seems like you've forgotten lately. Seems like you think Cross can just step in and change things. I haven't forgotten anything. Good. He dropped his hand and stepped back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He left the room. Clara heard him walk through the kitchen, heard the back door open and close as he went outside, probably to smoke, maybe to drink whatever whiskey he had stashed in the woodshed. She sat down on the bed and let out a breath she'd been holding too long. The apology had been worse than the bruises. At least bruises were honest. At least pain told you where you stood. But this careful manipulation, this pretense of reasonableness while his thumb pressed against her face like a promise, this was the James who scared her most. The one who made her doubt her own perception, made her wonder if maybe she was overreacting, maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed, maybe she was the problem after all. She lay down and stared at the ceiling. The room was dark except for moonlight coming through the small window. Somewhere outside a coyote howled. Another answered from farther away. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She dreamed of windows and bruises and a man's voice saying, "You're under my protection now," like it meant something. The next morning started the same. Before dawn, cold kitchen, coffee and bacon and biscuits for 15 hungry men. But something had shifted in the air. Clara felt it the moment she lit the stove. A tension that hadn't been there yesterday, or maybe it had been building and she'd just been too focused on surviving to notice. Miguel arrived first as usual, but this time he didn't sit in the corner with his newspaper. He stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the yard. Something wrong? Clara asked. Just keeping an eye out. For what? Miguel looked at her. For trouble. Before she could ask what that meant, the other hands started arriving. Tommy came in talking fast about a horse that had gotten loose during the night. Marcus and John were arguing about whose turn it was to mend the fence. William carried a book under his arm, like always, something thick with small print. They sat. They ate. They didn't talk to Clara except to nod thanks. Normal. Safe. Then Ethan walked in, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He looked like he hadn't slept. Eyes harder than yesterday, jaw set in a way that said he'd made a decision and wasn't interested in debate. "Where's James?" Ethan asked. The question was directed at the room in general, but everyone's eyes went to Clara. "Still asleep," she said quietly. "Wake him up. I need him out here." Clara set down the coffee pot and headed for the bedroom. Her hand was on the doorknob when Ethan spoke again. "Actually, Mrs. Whitlock, stay here. Miguel, go wake him." Miguel moved immediately. Didn't question, didn't hesitate, just walked past Clara, opened the door, and disappeared into the dark room. There was shouting, muffled but angry. Then James appeared in the doorway, shirt half-buttoned, hair wild, face red with sleep and rage. "The hell is this?" James demanded. "This is me informing you that your employment at Cross Ranch is terminated effective immediately," Ethan said calmly. "You have until noon to gather your belongings and leave the property." The kitchen went silent. James stared at Ethan like he'd spoken a foreign language. "You're firing me." "That's correct." "For what?" "I didn't do anything." "You violated the terms of your employment. I told you yesterday that violence against anyone on my property, including your wife, would result in immediate dismissal." "I didn't touch her." Ethan's eyes went to Clara. "Roll up your sleeve." She froze. "Clara, roll up your sleeve and show these men your left arm." "Now wait just a damn minute," James started. "Shut your mouth," Ethan said, and the command in his voice was absolute. "Mrs. Whitlock, please." Claire's hands were shaking. Every man in that kitchen was looking at her, waiting, judging, calculating what this meant for them, for the ranch, for the invisible rules that governed how men and women were supposed to interact out here. She rolled up her sleeve. The bruises were darker than last night. 5 perfect fingerprints wrapped around her arm like a brand. Someone sucked in a breath. Might have been Tommy. Might have been William. "You did that yesterday morning," Ethan said to James, "in this kitchen, after I explicitly warned you what would happen if you laid hands on her again." "That's between me and my wife. Not on my land, it isn't." Ethan stood. "You're done here, James. Pack your things and go." "You can't do this." "I got rights. You have the right to leave peacefully or be escorted off by force. Choose." James looked around the room, searching for allies, for someone who'd back him up against this insanity. But the ranch hands just stared at their plates. Miguel stood by the door, hand resting casual-like on the knife at his belt. "This is because of her," James said, pointing at Clara. "Because she went crying to you, made herself out to be some victim." "She didn't say a word to me," Ethan interrupted. "Didn't have to. I have eyes. I can see what's in front of me. She's my wife. And you're fired. We done here, or do I need to make this uglier than it already is?" James's face had gone from red to purple, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. Clara could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Same as yesterday, pride versus money, anger versus survival. But this time the math was different. This time he'd already lost the job. Had nothing left to lose except the woman standing frozen by the stove. He turned to her. "Get your things. We're leaving." Clara didn't move. "I said get your things." "Mrs. Whitlock is employed by this ranch," Ethan said. "She stays or goes as she chooses, not as you command." "She's my wife. She goes where I go." "Is that true, Clara?" Ethan's voice was softer now. "Do you want to go with him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Every person in that room knew what she was supposed to say, knew what a good wife, a proper woman, a decent human being would say when her husband demanded she come with him. Clara looked at James, at the man she'd promised to honor and obey 6 years ago in a church that smelled like lilies and dust. The man who'd smiled at her father and shaken her brother's hand and sworn he'd keep her safe. The man who'd given her nothing but fear and bruises and the slow erosion of everything she used to be. She looked at Ethan, at a man she barely knew who was offering her something that might be protection or might be a different kind of trap, who was asking her to make a choice that would change everything, burn every bridge, cut every tie to the life she knew. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I want to stay." James went very still. "What did you say?" "I want to stay," Clara repeated, louder this time. "I want to keep my job." "You want to—" James laughed, sharp and bitter. "You think you get to make that choice? You think you can just decide to stay here working for him while I leave? What kind of wife does that?" "The kind who's tired of being hit," Clara said. The words came out before she could stop them. Came out in front of 15 men who would talk, who would spread this story across Red Hollow and beyond, who would make her the woman who defied her husband and destroyed her marriage and forgot her place. But they were out now. Couldn't take them back. James moved fast, crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and grabbed for her. Not her arm this time, her throat. He didn't make it. Miguel stepped in from the side and caught James's wrist mid-reach, twisted it down and back with practiced efficiency until James was bent forward, off balance, gasping. "Don't," Miguel said quietly. "Get your hands off me." Ethan was there now too, standing between James and Clara. "You're done. Leave now, or I'll have you arrested for assault." "Assault? I'm her husband, and she's my employee, and you just tried to attack her in front of 14 witnesses. Sheriff Carson is a friend of mine. Want to test how that plays out?" James struggled against Miguel's grip for another few seconds. Then the fight went out of him all at once. He went slack, breathing hard, eyes wild. "Let me go," he said. Miguel looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded. Miguel released him and stepped back, still watchful. James straightened up slowly, rubbed his wrist, looked at Clara with something that might have been hurt if you didn't know him well enough to recognize it as rage. "You're making a mistake," James said. "You think he's going to take care of you? Think he's going to give you anything but more trouble?" Clara didn't answer. "This ain't over," James continued. "You're still my wife, still bound to me by law and contract. You can hide here all you want, but eventually you're going to have to come home. And when you do, when she does, it'll be her choice," Ethan said. "Until then, she stays here, under my roof, under my protection." "Your protection?" James spat the words like poison. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a man who wants another man's wife. That's all this is. That's all it's ever been." "Believe what you want, but you need to leave, now." James looked around the kitchen one more time, at the men who wouldn't meet his eyes, at Miguel standing ready, at Ethan blocking his path to Clara, at Clara herself, who'd somehow found the courage to say no and mean it. "This town's going to hear about this," James said. "Everyone's going to know what kind of woman you are, what kind of man he is. You think your life's hard now? Just wait." He grabbed his coat and hat and walked out. Didn't slam the door this time either, just closed it quiet and final, like a coffin lid. Clara stood by the stove, arms wrapped around herself, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The men started eating again, slowly at first, then with more purpose. Tommy said something about the weather. Marcus agreed. John asked William what he was reading. The conversation rebuilt itself around the hole James had left, careful and deliberate, like men stepping over a grave. Ethan touched Clara's shoulder, light, brief, nothing that could be misconstrued. "You all right?" She nodded, didn't trust her voice. "Take the day off. Go rest. Miguel will handle anything that comes up. I can work." "I know you can. But you don't have to, not today." Clara looked up at him. "What happens now?" "Now you stay here. Sleep in the spare room in the main house until we figure something more permanent out. Keep cooking for the ranch if you want, or don't. Your choice." "He's going to come back." "Probably." "He's going to cause trouble." "Definitely." Ethan's expression was grim. "But that's my problem to handle, not yours." "He's my husband." "He's a man who hurt you. That makes him my problem." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that someone with power and resources and a dozen armed ranch hands could actually keep her safe from a man who'd owned her for 6 years. But she'd learned not to trust easy promises. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For this. For everything." Ethan nodded and went back to his breakfast. The conversation continued around them. Nobody mentioned what had just happened. Nobody asked Clara if she was sure about her choice. They just made space for her at a table where she'd never been allowed to sit before. That afternoon, Clara moved her few belongings into a small room on the second floor of the main house. It had a real bed with a quilt, a window that looked out over the pasture, and a door with a lock on the inside. She locked it and sat on the bed and cried for the first time in 3 years. The town learned about it within 24 hours. Red Hollow wasn't big, maybe 300 people on a good day, most of them spread out across ranches and homesteads within a 10-mile radius. The actual town was just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a bank, and a sheriff's office. News traveled fast because there wasn't much else to do except talk. By the time Clara walked into the general store 2 days later, everyone knew that James Whitlock's wife had refused to leave with him, had chosen to stay at Cross Ranch, was living under Ethan Cross's roof. The whispers started before she made it past the front door. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, stood behind the counter with her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Two other women, Clara didn't know their names, just recognized them from church, stopped their conversation mid-sentence and stared. Clara kept her head down and headed for the flour. She needed supplies for the kitchen, needed to keep working, keep moving, keep pretending everything was normal even though her entire life had just imploded. "Shame what happened with James," Mrs. Henderson said loudly. "Such a good man, hard worker. Don't know what got into him, getting fired like that." Clara measured out flour into a sack. Didn't respond. "Of course, there's rumors," one of the other women said, "about why he got fired." "I heard he got violent," the other woman replied. "Started a fight with Mr. Cross over something." "Well, you know how men get when another man's sniffing around their wife." Clara's hand stilled on the flour scoop. "I'm sure it's not like that," Mrs. Henderson said, but her tone suggested she thought it was exactly like that. "Mrs. Whitlock's always seemed like a decent woman. Quiet. Keeps to herself." "Quiet women are sometimes the worst," the first woman said. "All that silence hiding all kinds of secrets." Clara set the flour down harder than necessary, turned to face them. "If you have something to say to me," she said, "say it directly instead of talking around me like I'm not here." Mrs. Henderson had the grace to look embarrassed. The other two women just stared. "We're just concerned," Mrs. Henderson said, "about appearances, about what people might think." "About what you think, you mean?" "Now, Clara, it was Mrs. Whitlock," Clara corrected, "and what I do or don't do is none of your concern." "It is when it affects the whole town," one of the other women said, "when it makes decent people look bad by association." "Decent people?" Clara laughed, sharp and humorless. "You want to talk about decent? Where were all you decent people when my husband was beating me? When I came in here with bruises on my face and you looked right through me like I was invisible?" Silence. "That's what I thought," Clara said. She turned back to her shopping. "My marriage is my business. Where I live is my business. Who I work for is my business. And if that bothers you, well, you're welcome to stop shopping wherever I might be." She finished gathering supplies in silence. Paid for them with money Ethan had given her wages, paid directly to her like he'd promised. Walked out with her head up and her hands steady. Made it halfway to the wagon before the shaking started. Miguel was waiting by the horses. He took one look at her face and took the supplies without a word. Loaded them into the wagon bed while Clara climbed up to the driver's seat. "They give you trouble?" Miguel asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "You want me to say something?" "No, I want to go home." Home. The word felt strange. The ranch wasn't home. The little room upstairs wasn't home. But it was somewhere she could lock a door and breathe without waiting for a fist. That was close enough. They rode back in silence. The sun was high and hot, and Clara could feel sweat pooling under her collar, trickling down her spine. The bruises on her arm had started to fade to yellow-green. In another week they'd be gone completely, but the damage James had done would take longer to heal. Miguel pulled the wagon up to the kitchen, helped her unload the supplies even though that wasn't his job, carried the heavy sacks while she directed him where things went. "Señora," he said when they'd finished, "may I say something?" "Of course." "What you did, standing up to your husband, choosing to stay, that took courage, real courage, the kind most men don't have, let alone women." Clara didn't know what to say to that. "But courage makes enemies," Miguel continued. "And James Whitlock is not the kind of man who forgives being embarrassed. You understand?" "I understand." "Good. Then you also understand that when he comes back, and he will come back, it will be with intent to harm. Not just you, everyone who helped you." "I never asked for help." "No, but you accepted it when offered. That's the same thing in his eyes." Miguel tipped his hat and left. Clara stood in the kitchen surrounded by flour and sugar and coffee, thinking about courage and consequences. She'd made her choice, burned her bridges, cut the ties. Now she had to live with whatever came next. That night, Ethan called a meeting in the bunkhouse. All the hands were there, Miguel, Tommy, Marcus, John, Jacob, William, sitting on bunks and leaning against walls while Ethan stood in the middle of the room. Clara wasn't invited, but she heard about it later from Tommy, who'd stopped by the kitchen for extra biscuits and couldn't keep his mouth shut to save his life. Boss laid it out straight, Tommy had said, mouthful of biscuit. Told us James is probably coming back. Told us to keep our eyes open and our mouths shut about ranch business. Said if anyone's got a problem with you staying here with how things went down, they could collect their pay and leave. No hard feelings. Did anyone leave? Claire asked. Hell no. We all know what James is. Known it for months. Nobody's going to quit over you finally standing up to him. What else did he say? Tommy had hesitated then. Said if James comes back and tries anything, we're to treat it like any other threat to the ranch. Meaning we're authorized to use force if necessary. Clara's stomach had tightened. He can't do that. James is still my husband. Still has legal rights. Legal rights don't mean much when a man's trespassing on private property with violent intent. That's what the boss said anyway. Tommy had grabbed another biscuit. Don't worry, Mrs. Whitlock. We got your back. Now Clara lay in her locked room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about men with guns standing between her and her husband. This was getting out of control, escalating in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd thought maybe Ethan would let her stay a few days, maybe help her figure out where to go next, maybe loan her enough money to get to the next town over and start fresh. She hadn't thought he'd essentially declare war on James, hadn't thought he'd mobilize his entire crew to protect her. Why would he do that? What did he get out of it? The questions circled in her head like buzzards. She didn't have answers, didn't trust the answers that suggested themselves, that maybe Ethan was just a decent man doing what he thought was right, that maybe some people helped without expecting anything in return. Those kinds of people didn't exist in Clara's experience. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had an angle. She just hadn't figured out Ethan's yet. A knock on the door made her jump. Mrs. Whitlock, it's Ethan. Clara got up and unlocked the door, opened it just wide enough to see him standing in the hallway, hat in his hands. Sorry to bother you, he said. Just wanted to check that you're settling in all right. I'm fine. Good. Also wanted to let you know I spoke with Sheriff Carson today. Told him the situation. He's aware that James might cause trouble. What did he say? Said he'd keep an eye out. Said if James shows up making threats or trying to force you to leave, to send someone for him immediately. Ethan paused. He also said that legally, James still has a claim to you as his wife, but that if you wanted to pursue a separation or divorce, he could point you toward a lawyer in the county seat. Divorce. The word felt impossible, dangerous, like something that happened to other people in other places, not to women like her in towns like this. I don't have money for a lawyer, Clara said. I could loan you No. The word came out sharper than she meant. No, I can't take money from you. People already think... She stopped. Think what? Clara looked at him standing there in her doorway, concern written all over his face, and suddenly she was furious. At him, at James, at herself. They think I'm your mistress, she said bluntly. Think you fired James so you could have me. Think I left my husband for you. Ethan's expression didn't change. I know. You know? That doesn't bother you? People are going to talk no matter what we do. Rather, they talk about me being inappropriate than talk about me ignoring a woman being beaten on my property. This is going to ruin your reputation. My reputation can handle it. It's not fair to you. Clara. He said her name soft, like he was gentling a spooked horse. I'm a grown man with money and power and a ranch. Whatever people say about me, I'll survive. You're a woman with nothing but the wages I pay you and a husband who wants to hurt you. We are not equally at risk here. Stop worrying about me and worry about yourself. She wanted to argue, wanted to push back against his certainty, his confidence that he could just decide to protect her and make it happen through sheer force of will. But she was so tired. Tired of being scared. Tired of calculating every move. Tired of surviving. Thank you, she said instead. For everything. Ethan nodded. Started to leave, then stopped. One more thing. I'm going to the county seat next week on business. If you want to come with me, talk to that lawyer. See what your options are. The offer stands. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. He left. Clara locked the door behind him and climbed back into bed. Outside her window, the ranch settled into nighttime sounds. Horses moving in the corral, coyotes talking to each other across the dark, wind rattling through the cottonwoods. And somewhere out there, James was planning his next move. Clara pulled the quilt up to her chin and tried not to think about what that move might be. James came back on a Tuesday. Not alone. Not quiet. He rode in at midday with 3 men Clara didn't recognize, rough-looking types with guns on their hips and meanness in their eyes. They pulled up to the ranch entrance like they owned it, horses kicking up dust, voices carrying across the yard. Clara was in the kitchen kneading bread when she heard the commotion, her hands stilled in the dough. Through the window she could see James dismounting, could see the way he stood with his chest out and his shoulders back, playing to an audience that was gathering fast. Miguel appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Stay inside, lock the door." "What's he doing?" "What we expected, making noise, trying to force the issue." Miguel's hand rested on his gun. "Just stay inside." He left before she could argue. Clara wiped the flour from her hands and moved to the window, heart hammering against her ribs. Ethan was already outside, standing between James and the house. The ranch hands had materialized from various corners of the property. Tommy from the barn, Marcus and John from the fence line, Jacob from the corral. They didn't draw weapons, didn't make threats, just positioned themselves in a loose semicircle behind Ethan, silent and watchful. "You're trespassing," Ethan said. His voice was calm, but it carried. "Leave now, or I'll have you removed." "I'm here for my wife," James shouted back. "I got a legal right to her. You can't keep her from me." "She's not property to be kept or returned. She's a person making her own choices. She's confused, doesn't know what she wants. You got her head all twisted up with lies and promises you can't keep." One of the men with James spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Just give him his wife back, Cross. This ain't your fight." "Who are you?" Ethan asked. "Friends of James? Here to make sure he gets what's his." "Well, friends of James, you're on my land without permission. That makes you trespassers. You've got 60 seconds to mount up and leave before I consider you a threat." The man laughed. "You threatening us? I'm informing you of the consequences of staying. What you do with that information is your choice." James stepped forward. "Clara, I know you can hear me. Get out here and stop hiding like a coward." Clara's hands gripped the windowsill. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, stay quiet, let the men handle this. But she was tired of hiding. She unlocked the kitchen door and stepped outside. The yard went silent. Every eye turned to her. She felt exposed standing there in her apron with flour still dusting her sleeves, felt small and breakable in a space full of armed men and barely contained violence. But she kept her chin up and her voice steady. "I'm not hiding, James. I'm working, same as I've been doing." James's face did something complicated, relief and rage and something that might have been actual hurt if she didn't know him better. "Baby, come here. Come talk to me. We can work this out." "There's nothing to work out." "The hell there isn't. You're my wife. You belong with me." "I belong to myself." The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign, like a language she'd never learned but suddenly understood. James took another step forward. Ethan shifted to block him. Miguel's hand went to his gun. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. "She's my wife," James repeated, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now. "She's mine. You can't just take her." "I didn't take anyone. She chose to stay. Because you manipulated her, filled her head with ideas about leaving me, about being independent, about—" James's voice cracked. "Clara, please. Whatever he told you, it's lies. I love you. I take care of you. We can go home right now and forget all this happened." Clara wanted to feel something, wanted to feel pity or guilt or even residual affection, but all she felt was tired. "You don't love me, James. You love owning me. There's a difference." "I never—" He stopped, started again. "I know I got rough sometimes. I know I lost my temper, but that's just how marriage is, how men and women work things out. You can't just run away because things get hard." "I'm not running. I'm standing right here." One of James's friends shifted his weight. His hand hovered near his gun. Tommy noticed and moved his own hand in response. The tension in the yard cranked tighter. "Last chance, James," Ethan said. "Leave peacefully or leave by force." "You don't have the authority—" "Actually, I do. This is my land. You're trespassing. I've asked you to leave multiple times. Under territorial law, I'm within my rights to remove you by any means necessary. Territorial law doesn't override marriage law. She's still my wife, still legally bound to me. You can keep her here today, maybe tomorrow, but eventually she's got to leave this ranch. And when she does, she'll be escorted by armed men who work for me," Ethan finished. "She'll never be alone, never be vulnerable. And if you try to take her by force, I'll have you arrested for kidnapping." "Kidnapping my own wife?" "Abducting a person against their will. That's the legal definition. Doesn't matter if you're married to them or not." James looked at his friends. They looked back with expressions that said they'd signed up for some light intimidation, not a standoff with a dozen armed ranch hands. "This ain't over," one of them muttered. "But it ain't worth dying over neither." He mounted his horse. The other two followed. They weren't leaving out of respect or fear, just a practical calculation that the odds had turned against them. But James didn't move. He stood there staring at Clara like if he looked hard enough, he could pull her back across the distance between them through sheer force of will. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he said. "And when you realize it, when you come crawling back because you got nowhere else to go and no one else to take you in, I might not be there. You understand? I might not want you anymore." "I understand," Clara said. Something in her voice must have finally convinced him. He turned and mounted his horse in one violent motion, wheeled the animal around and kicked it into a gallop, his friends following close behind. They disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust and fury. The ranch hands didn't relax. They stayed positioned, stayed watchful, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then Miguel gave a signal and they dispersed back to their work, the crisis averted but not forgotten. Ethan approached Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, didn't trust her voice yet. "That was brave. Stupid, but brave. I'm tired of being scared. Being scared keeps you alive sometimes. And sometimes it just keeps you trapped." Clara looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for his next move. Because that wasn't surrender, Clara. That was retreat. He'll be back." "I know. And next time he might not come during the day, might not announce himself." "I know that too." Ethan studied her face. "You sure you want to keep doing this? Because there's still time to back out, still time to go with him, smooth things over, go back to how things were." Clara thought about the bruises, the fear, the slow erosion of everything she'd once been, the kitchen where she'd learned to move like a ghost. "I'd rather die," she said simply. Ethan nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Then we fight. But we fight smart. Which means you don't go anywhere alone. Don't go into town without an escort. Don't open the door to anyone you don't know. Understood?" "Understood." "Good. Now get back inside and finish that bread. Smells like it's about ready for the oven." Clara went back to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking again, but she kneaded the dough smooth and shaped it into loaves and slid them into the oven like nothing had happened. Outside, the ranch returned to its normal rhythms, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn. A choice had been made public. There was no going back now. The town turned against her completely after that. It started small. The general store suddenly ran out of things Clara needed. Mrs. Henderson would check the back room and come up empty, apologetic but firm. Other customers who'd been friendly before now looked through her like she was invisible. The church was worse. Clara made the mistake of attending Sunday service, partly because she wanted to prove she wasn't ashamed, partly because she hoped maybe someone would show support. She should have known better. The moment she walked through the door, conversations stopped. People shifted away from her like she carried disease. When she sat down in an empty pew, the family in front of her got up and moved. Reverend Matthews preached about the sanctity of marriage, about wives submitting to their husbands, about the corruption that came when women forgot their place and men encouraged them in their rebellion. He didn't say Clara's name. Didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. After the service, a woman Clara barely knew approached her on the church steps. Mrs. Patricia Sutton, wife of the bank manager, dressed in expensive fabric and self-righteousness. "I feel compelled to speak to you," Mrs. Sutton said, "as a Christian woman concerned for your soul." Clara waited. "What you're doing is wrong. Abandoning your husband, living under another man's roof, it's shameful. It reflects poorly on all of us, on this entire community." "My husband beat me," Clara said flatly. He broke my ribs twice, blackened my eyes so bad I couldn't see for 3 days, put his hands around my throat and squeezed until I passed out. That's what I'm abandoning. Mrs. Sutton's face pinched tight. Marriage is difficult. All wives endure hardships. That doesn't give you the right to... To what? To choose not to die? To decide I'm worth more than being someone's punching bag? You're being dramatic. Men get frustrated. They express it physically sometimes. That's just nature. What you're doing, running to another man, letting him fight your battles, that's unnatural. That's the devil's work. Clara laughed. Couldn't help it. The absurdity was too much. I'm sorry, she said. Not sorry at all. I didn't realize getting beaten was natural and seeking help was evil. Thank you for clarifying. Don't mock me, girl. I'm trying to save you from yourself. I don't need saving. I need people to mind their own business and let me live. You're living in sin. I'm living in a room with a lock on the door. If that's sin, I'll take my chances. Mrs. Sutton's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then she turned on her heel and marched away, gathering other women around her, their heads close together in furious whispered conference. Clara walked back to the wagon where Miguel waited. He helped her up without comment, but she caught the slight smile at the corner of his mouth. Heard that went well, he said. About as well as expected. You know they're going to make this harder now. The women of this town can make life miserable when they decide someone's crossed a line. Let them try. I've survived worse than gossip. But Miguel was right. The social isolation intensified. Shops that used to serve her now claimed they couldn't. The seamstress refused to mend her clothes. The doctor's wife made it clear Clara wasn't welcome at any community gatherings. Even people Clara had thought were friendly. Women she'd cooked beside at church functions, men who'd worked alongside James, turned cold and distant. She was a scandal. A cautionary tale. A woman who'd forgotten her place and needed to be reminded through collective shunning. It would have broken her a month ago. Would have sent her crawling back to James begging for forgiveness and normalcy. But something had changed in Clara. Maybe it was having a door that locked. Maybe it was working for wages she actually kept. Maybe it was just that once you stood up and said no out loud, it got easier to keep saying it. She kept her head up, kept working, kept living in that room above the kitchen like she had every right to be there, because she did have the right. That was the part that made everyone so angry. She'd claimed a right nobody wanted to give her, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it except talk. Let them talk. Words couldn't hit as hard as fists. 3 weeks after James's failed attempt to retrieve her, a lawyer showed up at the ranch. His name was Robert Morrison, and he rode in on a fine horse, wearing clothes that cost more than Clara made in 6 months. He was young, maybe 30, with careful eyes and a leather satchel full of papers. Ethan met him in the yard. Clara watched from the kitchen window as they talked, as Morrison gestured and Ethan nodded, as papers changed hands. Then Ethan brought him inside. Mrs. Whitlock, this is Robert Morrison. He's a lawyer from the county seat. I asked him to come discuss your options regarding your marriage. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. I don't have money for a lawyer. Consider me already retained, Morrison said. His voice was educated, crisp. Mr. Cross has covered my fees. Clara looked at Ethan. I told you I couldn't, and I told you my reputation can handle it. Sit down, Clara. Listen to what he has to say. They sat at the kitchen table. Morrison pulled papers from his satchel and arranged them in neat piles. I've reviewed the basics of your situation, he said. You've been married to James Whitlock for 6 years. During that time, he's been physically violent toward you on multiple occasions. You've left the marital home and are now residing on property owned by your employer. Is that accurate? Yes. Has your husband attempted to force you to return? Yes. 3 weeks ago. He came with armed men. Morrison made notes. Did he make threats? Said I was his, said he had a legal right to me, said this wasn't over. Did he specify what he intended to do? Clara hesitated. Not directly, but the implication was clear. He'd take me back by force if he could. Good. That helps. Morrison looked up. Here's the situation legally. In this territory, divorce is possible but difficult. You need grounds, adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. Based on what Mr. Cross has told me and what you've just confirmed, you have a strong case for extreme cruelty. Will they believe me? A judge, I mean. Will they believe my word against his? That's the challenge, Morrison admitted. Typically, a husband's word carries more weight than a wife's, but we have some advantages. First, you have witnesses. The ranch hands who saw your bruises, who were present when James attempted to forcibly retrieve you. Second, you have a credible employer willing to testify on your behalf. Third, you have a documented pattern of injury that a doctor could potentially confirm. I never went to a doctor. But you treated injuries yourself, yes? You must have scars, evidence of past trauma. Clara thought about the crooked finger that had never set right, the ribs that ached when the weather changed, the faint white lines on her back from the time James used his belt. Yes, I have evidence. Then we have a case. It won't be easy. James will fight it. He'll claim you're lying, that you're being manipulated by Mr. Cross, that you're an unfaithful wife trying to abandon your sacred duties. The community will likely support him. They always do. But if we can get you in front of a judge and present the evidence clearly, we have a chance. A chance, Clara repeated, not a certainty. Nothing in law is certain, Mrs. Whitlock, but I believe we can win. The question is whether you're willing to fight for it. Clara looked at the papers spread across her kitchen table. Legal documents with words she barely understood, terms and conditions and clauses that would determine whether she owned her own life or remained property of a man who'd spent 6 years teaching her she was worthless. What happens if we lose? Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. If the judge rules against you, you'll be ordered to return to your husband. If you refuse, you could be held in contempt. You'd have no legal recourse, no protection. And James would have a court order essentially giving him permission to retrieve you by force. And if we win, you'd be granted a divorce. The marriage would be dissolved. You'd be free to live independently, work, own property, make your own decisions. You'd no longer be legally bound to James in any way. Free. The word hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Ethan leaned forward. Clara, you don't have to decide right now. You can think about it, take time. I'll do it, Clara said. You're sure? I'm sure. She looked at Morrison. When do we start? I'll file the petition this week. We'll need to serve James with notice which will alert him that you're pursuing legal action. He'll have the opportunity to respond, to hire his own lawyer. Then we'll have a hearing before a judge, likely in about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. A month and a half to prepare, to gather evidence, to convince a man in a robe that she deserved to be free. What do you need from me? Clara asked. Morrison pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I need you to tell me everything. Every time he hit you, every threat he made, every injury you sustained. I need dates, if you can remember them, details, anything that demonstrates a pattern of violence. And I need you to be prepared to say all of it again in court, in front of your husband and a room full of people who will judge you for it. Clara's hands trembled, but she folded them in her lap and started talking. She talked for 2 hours, told Morrison about the first time James hit her, 3 months after they were married, a backhand across the face for burning dinner, told him about the broken ribs, the black eyes, the time James kicked her so hard she couldn't walk for a week, told him about the small violences too, the insults, the isolation, the systematic destruction of everything she used to be. Morrison wrote it all down in neat, careful handwriting. Didn't interrupt, didn't judge. Just documented her life like it was evidence in a case, which it was. When she finished, her throat was raw and her eyes were dry. She'd cried all her tears months ago. Now there was just anger and determination and the thin, fragile hope that maybe justice was possible. This is good, Morrison said, gathering his papers. This is very good. I'll draft the petition and file it Monday. In the meantime, Mrs. Whitlock, I need you to stay safe. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't engage with your husband if he approaches you. And if he threatens you in any way, document it. Witnesses, written statements, anything we can use. I understand. Morrison stood and shook Ethan's hand. I'll be in touch. We have a strong case, Mr. Cross. With your testimony and the physical evidence, I'm confident we can convince the judge. After he left, Clara and Ethan sat in silence. You didn't have to do this, Clara said finally. Pay for a lawyer. Get involved in my mess. Yes, I did. Why? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. I had a sister once, Mary. She married a man who seemed decent, worked hard, didn't drink much, went to church. Year after their wedding, she came to visit with a broken arm, said she'd fallen. I believed her. Clara waited. 6 months later, she was dead. Fell down the stairs, her husband said. Broke her neck. Could have been an accident, except I saw her body at the funeral, saw the bruises on her arms, the marks on her throat. Knew exactly what kind of fall breaks a neck and leaves handprints. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I couldn't save her. Couldn't even prove what happened. Her husband moved to another territory and remarried within a year. Ethan looked at her. So when I see a woman being hurt by a man who's supposed to protect her, when I have the power to actually do something about it, I do it. Not for you, for Mary, for the chance I didn't get with her. Clara understood then. This wasn't about her. Wasn't about attraction or possession or any of the things people whispered about. It was about a man trying to rewrite an ending he couldn't change. Thank you, she said, for giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet. Wait until we win. And if we don't win? Ethan's expression went hard. Then we find another way. But we will get you free, Clara, one way or another. She believed him, which was either the smartest or stupidest thing she'd ever done. The petition was filed on Monday. James received notice on Tuesday. By Wednesday, the entire town knew that Clara Whitlock was suing her husband for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Reverend Matthews preached a special sermon about wives who destroyed families through false accusations. Mrs. Sutton organized a prayer group specifically to pray for Clara's soul and her return to righteousness. Men who worked with James made it known that any business associated with Ethan Cross would face consequences. The bank manager, Mr. Sutton, suggested to Ethan that perhaps his loan payment should be accelerated. The general store stopped selling to anyone from Cross Ranch. Even the saloon refused to serve Ethan's ranch hands. Red Hollow was making its position clear. Side with Clara. And you'd be treated like you had the plague. Most of Ethan's crew stayed loyal, but 3 hands quit within the week, not because they supported James, but because they couldn't afford to be shut out of town services. Couldn't buy supplies, couldn't drink, couldn't do business. It was economic warfare, and it was effective. Ethan didn't blink. He rode to the next town over, a 2-hour trip, and established new supply lines, paid his remaining hands extra to compensate for the inconvenience, made it clear that anyone who stood with him would be taken care of, town politics be damned. But Clara could see the cost, the lines deepening around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked the windows before bed, hand resting on his gun. This was escalating beyond a simple divorce case. This was becoming a war of principles, with her life as the battlefield. She almost backed out a dozen times, almost went to Morrison and told him to withdraw the petition, almost decided that being free wasn't worth destroying everyone who'd helped her. But then she'd remember the feeling of James's hands on her throat, remember the taste of blood from split lips, remember the weight of 6 years spent being invisible and afraid. And she'd decide to keep fighting. The hearing was set for late September. Clara had 6 weeks to prepare, 6 weeks to practice telling her story without breaking, 6 weeks to steel herself for standing in a courtroom and exposing every private shame to public scrutiny. Morrison coached her, taught her how to speak clearly, how to answer questions without elaborating, how to stay calm when James's lawyer attacked her credibility. "He's going to call you a liar," Morrison said during one practice session. "Going to suggest you're an adulteress using false accusations to justify abandoning your husband. How will you respond?" "I'll tell the truth." "Which is?" "That I'm not having an affair with anyone. That I work for Mr. Cross and live in his house because it's safer than living with a man who beats me. That the only lie is the one I told for 6 years, pretending everything was fine." "Good. Stay focused on facts. Don't get emotional, don't get defensive. Just state what happened and let the evidence speak." Clara practiced until her voice went flat and mechanical. Practiced until she could say the word beaten without flinching. Practiced until her own story felt like something that had happened to someone else, someone she used to know. It was the only way to survive telling it. 3 days before the hearing, James showed up at the ranch again. This time he was alone. This time he didn't bring guns or friends or threats. He came at dusk and stood at the property line, hat in his hands, looking almost apologetic. Miguel spotted him first and alerted Ethan. The ranch hands mobilized, but Ethan waved them back. "Let me talk to him," Ethan said. "Boss, that's not smart." "I'll be fine. Just keep your eyes open." Ethan walked out to meet James. Clara watched from the kitchen window, heart in her throat, hands gripping the counter hard enough to hurt. She couldn't hear what they said, but she saw James's body language, submissive, almost pleading. Saw him gesture back toward town, toward the road, toward the future maybe. Saw Ethan listen with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then James put his hat back on and rode away. Ethan came back inside, found Clara in the kitchen. "What did he want?" she asked. "To make a deal. Said if you drop the divorce petition, he'll agree to a legal separation. You can live here, keep working, keep your wages. He won't bother you, won't try to force you back. You just have to stay married on paper and not humiliate him in court." Clara's breath caught. It was more than she'd ever hoped for a month ago. Freedom without the fight, safety without the scandal. "What did you tell him?" "Told him it wasn't my decision. Told him you'd consider it and let him know." Clara turned back to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, beautiful and temporary, like everything else. "It's a trap," she said quietly. "Probably." "He'd never actually let me go. He'd wait until the attention died down, then find a way to force me back. That's what I'd do if I were him. So it's not really an offer. It's just a different kind of cage." Ethan came to stand beside her. "What do you want to do?" Clara thought about Mary, about a woman who'd died still trapped, about all the women who'd accepted compromise and called it survival. "I want to go to court," she said. "I want to stand in front of a judge and tell the truth. I want a real divorce, legal and final. I want to own my own life." "Then that's what we'll do." "Even if we lose?" "Even if we lose, at least we'll have tried." Clara nodded. The decision settled in her chest, heavy and certain. 3 days until the hearing, 3 days until she'd either walk out of that courtroom free or be dragged back to the life she'd escaped, 3 days until everything changed. She went back to kneading bread. The dough was smooth and elastic under her hands. She worked it until her arms ached, until the rhythm steadied her racing heart. Outside, the ranch prepared for war. Inside, Clara prepared to fight for something nobody thought she deserved. Her life, her choice, her freedom. And she'd be damned if she'd back down now. The county courthouse was a 2-story brick building that looked like it had been built to intimidate. Clara stood outside staring up at it, hands clenched in the folds of her dress, trying to breathe normally. "You ready?" Morrison asked. He stood beside her with his leather satchel, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Clara had made in her entire life. "No." "Good. If you felt ready, I'd be worried you didn't understand what we're walking into." He adjusted his collar. "Remember what we practiced. Answer the questions directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. Look at the judge when you speak, not at James. And Clara." He paused. "No matter what his lawyer says about you, no matter how they try to twist your words or make you seem like you're lying, just tell the truth. That's all we need." Clara nodded. Her throat felt too tight to speak. Ethan came up behind them. He dressed carefully too, clean shirt, vest, his good hat, trying to look respectable for people who'd already decided he was corrupting another man's wife. "Miguel and the others are here," Ethan said. "They're waiting inside. You've got support, Clara. You're not alone in this." She wanted to believe him, but when they walked through those courthouse doors, she saw exactly how alone she was. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled with people from Red Hollow who'd come to watch the spectacle. Mrs. Sutton sat in the front row with her prayer group, all of them in their Sunday best, faces arranged in identical expressions of righteous disapproval. Reverend Matthews stood in the back, arms crossed. The bank manager, the store owner, the saloon keeper, everyone who'd made Clara's life difficult over the past weeks had shown up to see her fail. And there, at the defendant's table, sat James. He'd cleaned up too. Shaved, combed his hair, wore clothes Clara had washed and mended 100 times. He looked almost respectable, almost like the man she'd married 6 years ago, before she learned what those hands could do when nobody was watching. His lawyer sat beside him, a man named Richard Carver, who'd ridden in from the territorial capital specifically for this case. Expensive, experienced, and known for defending men against accusations from their wives. He had a reputation for making women look like liars. Morrison led Clara to their table. Ethan sat directly behind them with Miguel, Tommy, and Marcus, the only friendly faces in a sea of hostility. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as Judge Henry Blackwell entered. Blackwell was in his 60s, gray-haired and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be impressed by much anymore. He sat behind the bench and surveyed the packed courtroom with something close to disgust. "I understand this case has attracted considerable attention," he said dryly. "Let me be clear. I will not tolerate disruptions, outbursts, or demonstrations of any kind. This is a court of law, not a town meeting. Anyone who cannot control themselves will be removed. Is that understood?" Murmurs of agreement. "Good. Mr. Morrison, you filed a petition for divorce on behalf of Clara Whitlock on grounds of extreme cruelty. Please present your case." Morrison stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. We will demonstrate through testimony and physical evidence that Mrs. Whitlock has been subjected to systematic physical abuse by her husband, James Whitlock, throughout their 6-year marriage. This abuse has included broken bones, severe bruising, choking, and credible threats to her life. We will show that she left the marital home in fear for her safety and that she is entitled to a divorce under territorial law." "Mr. Carver, your response?" Carver stood with the easy confidence of a man who'd won this argument before. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitlock denies these allegations completely. What we have here is a wife who has abandoned her husband under the influence of her employer, Ethan Cross, with whom she is currently residing. The so-called evidence of abuse is either fabricated or the result of normal marital discord. We will demonstrate that Mrs. Whitlock is pursuing this divorce not because she's been harmed, but because she wishes to be free to continue an improper relationship with Mr. Cross." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel. "Order! I said order!" He glared at both lawyers. "This court will determine the facts based on evidence, not speculation or character assassination. Mr. Morrison, call your first witness." "I call Clara Whitlock to the stand." Clara's legs felt like water as she walked to the witness box. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, hands folded in her lap to hide the shaking. Morrison approached her with a gentle expression that was probably meant to be comforting, but just made her more nervous. "Mrs. Whitlock, please state your full name and age for the record." "Clara Ann Whitlock." 24 years old. "And how long have you been married to James Whitlock?" 6 years this past April." "During those 6 years, did your husband ever strike you?" Clara looked at the judge like Morrison had told her to. "Yes." "How many times would you estimate?" "I stopped counting after 50. The courtroom stirred. Judge Blackwell wrote something down. "Can you describe the first time he hit you?" Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. 3 months after we married. I burned dinner. The meat was too tough. He backhanded me across the face, split my lip, told me if I couldn't cook proper, I wasn't worth keeping." "Did he apologize?" "Later. Said he was sorry, said it wouldn't happen again. I believed him." "When did it happen again?" 2 weeks later. I forgot to mend a shirt. He shoved me into the wall hard enough to bruise my shoulder blade." Morrison walked her through it methodically. The escalation from slaps to punches, the broken ribs. The time James kicked her so hard she couldn't stand for 3 days. The pattern of violence followed by apologies, followed by more violence. Clara recited it all in that flat, practiced voice, turned her life into evidence, turned her pain into testimony that could be cross-examined and challenged and dismissed. "Mrs. Whitlock, I need you to show the court your left arm." Clara rolled up her sleeve. The bruises had faded but were still visible, yellowed fingerprints against her pale skin. "When did you receive these injuries?" 6 weeks ago. The morning Mr. Cross fired my husband. James grabbed my arm when I was washing dishes, told me I'd embarrassed him and I'd regret it. Were there witnesses? Miguel Santos came in while he was holding me. James let go. And after that incident, you chose not to return home with your husband. Why? Because I was tired of being hurt, tired of being scared. Mr. Cross offered me protection, and I took it. Morrison nodded. Your witness, Mr. Carver. Carver stood slowly, like a predator that had all the time in the world. He circled around to face Clara directly. Mrs. Whitlock, you claim your husband hit you over 50 times, yet you have no medical records documenting these injuries. Why not? I never went to a doctor. Why not? Because doctors asked questions and questions made James angry. Or because there were no injuries serious enough to require medical attention? No, because I was too scared to tell anyone what was happening. Too scared to tell anyone, yet you're willing to announce it to this entire courtroom? Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Morrison stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, Mr. Carver. Ask your questions without editorial commentary. Carver smiled. Mrs. Whitlock, where do you currently reside? At Cross Ranch? In a room above the kitchen. And where does Mr. Ethan Cross reside? In the main house. How far is your room from his? Clara saw where this was going. Down the hall, maybe 30 feet. 30 feet, very close quarters. And you say there's nothing improper happening between you and Mr. Cross? That's correct. You expect this court to believe that you're living in the same house as an unmarried man, sleeping 30 feet from his bedroom, and there's no romantic or physical relationship? Yes, because it's the truth. The truth. Carver pulled a paper from his folder. I have a statement here from Mrs. Patricia Sutton, who claims she saw you and Mr. Cross in conversation outside the general store, standing very close together, his hand on your shoulder. Does that sound familiar? He was helping me into the wagon. That's all. That's all. Just as it's all innocent when he pays for your legal representation, when he houses you and feeds you and protects you from your lawful husband. He's helping me because I needed help. There's nothing else to it. Nothing else, Carver repeated mockingly. Mrs. Whitlock, isn't it true that you left your husband not because he hurt you, but because you wanted to be with Ethan Cross? No. Isn't it true that you fabricated these abuse allegations to justify abandoning your marriage vows? No. Isn't it true that you're an adulteress using this court to legitimize your sinful behavior? No. Claire's voice rose despite herself. I left because my husband beat me, because he broke my ribs and blackened my eyes and put his hands around my throat, because I was afraid he'd kill me. Yet you have no proof. I have scars. Clara stood up, hands shaking. I have broken bones that healed wrong. I have years of fear and pain and surviving when I should have been living. That's my proof. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel. Mrs. Whitlock, please sit down. Clara sat. Her heart was hammering and she'd broken every rule Morrison had given her about staying calm, but the words were out now. The truth was spoken. Carver looked pleased with himself. No further questions, Your Honor. Morrison stood for redirect. Mrs. Whitlock, you mentioned scars. Would you be willing to show them to the court? Clara looked at James. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger exactly, something colder. Yes, she said. Your Honor, may Mrs. Whitlock approach the bench privately to display evidence of past injuries? Judge Blackwell nodded. Bailiff, clear the spectators from the front row. This will be viewed by the court only. There were protests from the gallery, but they complied. Clara approached the bench with Morrison. She turned her back to the courtroom and unbuttoned the top of her dress far enough to show her shoulders and upper back. The scars were there. White lines crisscrossing her skin from the belt James used when he was too angry for fists. A burn mark shaped like a cigar where he'd held it against her shoulder blade until she screamed. The crooked ridge of a collarbone that had broken and healed without being set properly. Judge Blackwell's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He looked at the scars for a long moment, then at James. You may button your dress, Mrs. Whitlock. Return to your seat. Clara did. Her hands fumbled with the buttons, but she got them closed eventually. Mr. Morrison, call your next witness. I call Ethan Cross. Ethan took the stand and was sworn in. He sat straight-backed and calm, hands resting on the arms of the chair. Morrison approached. Mr. Cross, how long have you known Clara Whitlock? About 10 months, since I hired her to cook for my ranch. During that time, did you ever observe injuries on her person? Yes, multiple times. Bruises on her arms and face, mostly. Once I saw her moving like her ribs were hurt, careful, shallow breathing, holding her left side. Did you ask her about these injuries? No, not at first. It wasn't my place. What changed? Ethan looked directly at James. I saw her husband grab her arm hard enough to leave bruises. Saw the way she flinched when he raised his voice. Saw enough to know what was happening. After that, I made it my place. And what did you do? I told James that violence on my property wouldn't be tolerated, that if he laid hands on Clara again, he'd be fired. Did he comply? For a few weeks. Then I saw fresh bruises. That's when I terminated his employment and offered Clara protection. Why did you do that, mister? Cross? What was your motivation? Ethan was quiet for a moment. I had a sister who died because no one helped her when her husband was beating her. I wasn't going to watch another woman go through that if I could prevent it. Have you had any romantic or physical relationship with Mrs. Whitlock? No. None at all? None. She works for me. She lives in my house because it's safer than living with a violent man. That's the extent of our relationship. Carver stood for cross-examination. Mr. Cross, you claim to have no romantic interest in Mrs. Whitlock, yet you've paid for her legal representation. That's rather generous for a mere employee, wouldn't you say? I pay my workers fair wages and treat them with dignity. That includes ensuring they're not being abused. Do you pay lawyers for all your employees? I haven't needed to. Mrs. Whitlock is the only one married to a violent man. Allegedly violent, Carver corrected. We haven't established that as fact. I've seen the bruises. I've seen the scars. That's fact enough for me. You're not a doctor, Mr. Cross. You don't know how those injuries were obtained. I know what bruises shaped like fingers mean. I know what belt scars look like. I know the difference between someone who fell and someone who was hit. Carver changed tactics. Mr. Cross, isn't it true that you've had financial difficulties recently, that several businesses in Red Hollow have refused to work with you? That's true. And that's because you're protecting another man's wife, correct? Because the community disapproves of your actions? The community can disapprove all they want. I'm not running a popularity contest. But these financial difficulties, they must be significant. The bank has demanded accelerated loan payments. Your usual suppliers have cut you off. This crusade of yours is costing you considerable money and standing. Why continue? Because it's the right thing to do. The right thing, Carver repeated. Or because you want something in return. Perhaps you expect Mrs. Whitlock to be grateful? Grateful enough to overlook the impropriety of your living arrangements? There's no impropriety to overlook. Come now, Mr. Cross. You're an unmarried man in your prime. Mrs. Whitlock is an attractive woman living under your roof. You expect this court to believe nothing has happened between you? I expect this court to believe the truth. Mrs. Whitlock is my employee. I've offered her protection from a man who is hurting her. If that makes me guilty of something, so be it. Carver smiled. No further questions. The testimony continued. Miguel took the stand and described what he'd witnessed. Tommy testified about seeing Clara's bruises. Even old Jacob, who barely spoke to anyone, got up and confirmed that everyone on the ranch had known James was violent. Then Carver called his witnesses. Reverend Matthews testified that Clara had always seemed devoted to her husband, that he'd never observed signs of abuse, that she'd never come to him for help or guidance. Mrs. Sutton claimed Clara had been flirting with Ethan for months before leaving James. The bank manager suggested Ethan had seduced Clara as part of some scheme to damage James's reputation. It was all speculation and innuendo, but it was effective. Carver was building a narrative, not of a battered wife seeking freedom, but of an adulteress using false accusations to justify her sin. Finally, James took the stand. He sat in the witness box looking wounded and confused, like a man who couldn't understand how his life had fallen apart. Mr. Whitlock, Carver began, did you ever strike your wife? I'm not proud of it, but yes. A few times, when I'd been drinking mostly, but never like she's saying, never broke her ribs or choked her or any of that. What about the bruises witnesses have described? Clara bruises easy, always has. She'd bump into furniture and have marks for weeks. I tried to be careful with her, tried to make sure she didn't hurt herself, but she's clumsy sometimes. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded reasonable. Clara felt sick. Did you love your wife? Carver asked. I do love her, still do. That's why this is so hard. watching her throw away our marriage over nothing. Over nothing? Over whatever Cross has been whispering in her ear, making her think she's too good for me, that she deserves better. But I provided for her, kept a roof over her head. Maybe I wasn't perfect, but what husband is? If the court grants Mrs. Whitlock this divorce, what will you do? James looked directly at Clara. I'll accept it. I'll let her go. But I want everyone to know I never wanted this. I wanted my wife back, wanted to work things out like married people are supposed to. This is all Cross is doing, turning her against me. Morrison stood for cross-examination. Mr. Whitlock, you claim you struck your wife only a few times when drinking. How many times would you estimate? Maybe 5 or 6. Over 6 years. Mrs. Whitlock testified to over 50 incidents. She's lying? She's mistaken. Or she's counting arguments as abuse. I raised my voice sometimes, sure. What man doesn't? Did you grab her arm 6 weeks ago and leave fingerprint bruises? James hesitated. I might have grabbed her. I was upset about being fired, but I didn't mean to hurt her. You grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises that lasted for weeks, but you didn't mean to hurt her. I don't know my own strength sometimes. Morrison pulled out photographs, Clara's scars documented by a doctor Morrison had hired specifically for that purpose. Mr. Whitlock, can you explain how your wife received these belt scars on her back? James stared at the photos. I don't know. Maybe from before we married. Maybe from what? Accidental belting? These are deliberate strikes, Mr. Whitlock. Multiple impacts from a leather strap. I didn't. James was sweating now. Maybe once or twice I used a belt, but only when she really disobeyed. Only when there was no other way to make her listen. The courtroom went silent. Morrison let that statement hang in the air for a long moment. No other way to make her listen. You mean no other way to control her through violence? I mean, that's not what I meant. You just admitted to striking your wife with a belt, to using physical punishment to enforce obedience. Is that correct? It was discipline. A husband has the right to beat his wife with a belt? Carver stood. Objection. Counsel is mischaracterizing. Overruled, Judge Blackwell said. His voice was cold. Mr. Whitlock, please answer the question. James looked around the courtroom desperately. I was just trying to be a good husband, trying to keep my household in order. That's what men do. By hitting their wives? By maintaining discipline. Morrison turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. James climbed down from the witness box looking like he'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Both sides gave closing arguments. Carver tried to salvage his case by focusing on the impropriety of Clara living with Ethan, suggesting the whole thing was a scheme to legitimize adultery. Morrison kept it simple, showed the evidence of abuse, reminded the court of James's own admission, and asked for Clara to be granted the divorce she deserved. Then it was done. Judge Blackwell called a recess to consider his ruling. Clara sat at the table with Morrison and waited. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, brief, supportive, nothing improper. Miguel and the others sat behind them, silent. Across the aisle, James stared at his hands. Carver whispered something to him, and he nodded without looking up. 30 minutes passed. An hour. The courtroom was hot and stuffy, and packed with people who all seemed to be holding their breath. Finally, the bailiff called them back to order. Judge Blackwell returned to the bench. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented in this case, he began. This has been one of the more disturbing proceedings I've had to oversee. What's clear to me is that both parties have suffered in this marriage. What's also clear is that the suffering has not been equal or equivalent. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Mrs. Whitlock has demonstrated through testimony, physical evidence, and multiple witnesses that she has been subjected to systematic physical abuse. She has scars consistent with deliberate violence. She has injuries that could not have been self-inflicted or accidental. And most damningly, Mr. Whitlock admitted under oath to striking his wife with a belt as a form of discipline. James started to stand. Carver pulled him back down. While some may argue that a certain degree of physical correction is within a husband's rights, the law in this territory is clear. Extreme and repeated violence constitutes grounds for divorce. The evidence presented meets that threshold. Furthermore, I find Mrs. Whitlock's testimony credible and Mr. Whitlock's denials unconvincing. Clara couldn't breathe. Therefore, I am granting Clara Whitlock a full divorce from James Whitlock on grounds of extreme cruelty. The marriage is dissolved effective immediately. Mrs. Whitlock is free to live independently, maintain her own employment, and make her own decisions without interference from her former husband. The courtroom erupted. Some people shouted in protest. Others gasped. Mrs. Sutton looked like she might faint. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I'm not finished." The noise died down. "Mr. Whitlock, you are hereby ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from Mrs. Whitlock at all times. You may not contact her, threaten her, or interfere with her employment. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Do you understand?" James didn't answer, just sat there staring at nothing. "Mr. Whitlock, do you understand?" "Yes," James said finally. His voice was hollow. "Good. This case is closed. Court dismissed." The gavel came down one last time. Clara sat frozen. She'd won. The judge had believed her, had granted the divorce, had set her free. Morrison was grinning and shaking Ethan's hand. Miguel and the others were standing up, looking relieved and vindicated. But Clara just sat there, staring at her hands, trying to process that it was over. She was free. Legally, officially, completely free. No longer Clara Whitlock, property of James, just Clara. Herself. Alone and terrified and free. Someone touched her shoulder. She looked up to see Ethan crouched beside her chair. "You did it," he said softly. "You fought and you won." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "What do I do now?" "Whatever you want. That's what freedom means." She stood on shaking legs, turned to leave the courtroom, had to walk past James to get to the door. He looked up as she passed. Their eyes met for just a second. He looked broken, lost, like a man who'd just realized everything he'd taken for granted could be taken away. Clara felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, no regret. Just the overwhelming relief of walking away. She walked out of that courthouse into afternoon sunlight. The air smelled like dust and horses and possibility. Behind her, Red Hollow could whisper and judge and condemn all it wanted. She'd stood in front of them all and told the truth, had exposed every private shame to public scrutiny, and she'd won. The chains were broken, the cage was open, and for the first time in 6 years, Clara could breathe. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Clara sat in the wagon beside Ethan, hands folded in her lap, staring at the road ahead without really seeing it. Miguel rode behind them on horseback, keeping watch like he expected James to appear from behind every rock and tree. He didn't. The road stayed empty. The sky stayed clear. The world continued turning like nothing monumental had just happened. But everything had changed. Clara was free, legally divorced, no longer bound to a man who'd spent 6 years teaching her she was worthless. The judge had said so in front of everyone, had made it official with a gavel and legal documents that Morrison carried in his satchel. She should feel triumphant, should feel vindicated, should feel something other than this strange hollowness in her chest. "You're quiet," Ethan said. Clara nodded, didn't trust her voice yet. "You all right?" "I don't know what I am." Ethan was silent for a moment. The wagon creaked and swayed over ruts in the road. "It's strange, isn't it? Getting what you wanted? Sometimes it doesn't feel like you thought it would." "I thought I'd feel happy." "And you don't?" Clara considered. "I feel empty, like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that now it's gone. I don't know how to walk without the weight." "That'll pass. Give it time." "How much time?" "However much you need." Ethan glanced at her. "There's no rule book for this, Clara. No right way to feel after what you've been through. You're allowed to be confused or scared or angry or nothing at all." "What if I don't know how to be free?" "Then you learn, same as you learned everything else, one day at a time." They arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting. The hands were waiting in the yard, all of them, even the ones who'd been out working the far pastures. They'd heard the news somehow, probably from Tommy who'd ridden ahead. When Clara climbed down from the wagon, they started clapping. It wasn't loud or showy, just a slow, steady applause that acknowledged what she'd done, what she'd survived. The courage it took to stand up in that courtroom and expose every private shame to public judgment. Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. She blinked them back and nodded her thanks, not trusting herself to speak. Miguel stepped forward. "Señora Clara," he said formally, "you are a very brave woman. It has been an honor to know you." "Thank you," she managed, "for everything, for standing with me when the whole town was against us. We do not abandon our own. You are part of this ranch now. That means something here." The other hands murmured agreement. Even Jacob, who barely spoke, nodded gravely. Ethan dismissed them to finish the day's work. They dispersed slowly, still casting glances back at Clara like they wanted to say more but didn't have the words. Clara went to the kitchen. She needed to be in motion, needed familiar work to ground her. She lit the stove and started preparing dinner. Beef stew with vegetables from the garden, biscuits, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Her hands moved automatically through the tasks, chopping onions, browning meat, measuring flour. The kitchen smelled like home in a way her old room with James never had. This space was hers. She'd claimed it through work and skill and the simple act of showing up every day. Ethan came in as she was rolling out biscuit dough. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table watching her work. "You don't have to cook tonight," he said. "We can manage on our own. You should rest." "I don't want to rest. I want to do something normal." "This is normal for you? Cooking for 15 men after the day you just had?" "This is the only normal I've got right now." Clara cut biscuits with quick, practiced movements. "Everything else feels like someone else's life, but this I understand." Ethan sipped his coffee. "Morrison said the divorce papers will be filed officially next week. After that, you're completely clear. James can't contest it, can't appeal. It's done." "And the restraining order?" 100 yards. He comes closer than that, he goes to jail. Sheriff Carson made that very clear. Clara slid the biscuits into the oven. "Do you think he'll actually stay away?" "I think James is a lot of things, but he's not stupid. He saw what happened today. Saw that the town might whisper about you, but when it came down to it, the law sided with you. That's got to sting." "Good. I hope it does sting. I hope it keeps him up at night knowing he lost." Ethan smiled slightly. "There's that anger. Was starting to worry you'd lost it." "I didn't lose anything. I just don't know what to do with it yet." "You'll figure it out. You're good at figuring things out." Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What happens now? With the ranch, I mean. With me working here. What do you want to happen?" "I want to keep cooking, want to keep working, but I also know that people are going to talk even more now. Going to say things about us living under the same roof, about impropriety and scandal and—" "Let them talk," Ethan interrupted. "We know the truth. That's all that matters." "Is it? Because that talk affects you too. Affects your business, your reputation. I heard what Carver said in court about the bank calling in your loans, about suppliers refusing to work with you. I'm costing you money. You're costing me the approval of people whose opinions I don't value. That's not the same thing as costing me something important. But the ranch is fine. I've got new suppliers in the next county. The bank can call in whatever loans they want. I'll pay them off and find financing elsewhere. Red Hollow doesn't own me, Clara. They can make things difficult, but they can't break me." Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen how towns worked, how social pressure could crush even strong men. What if it gets worse? What if they keep pushing? "Then I'll keep pushing back, same as I've been doing." "Why? Why risk so much for me?" Ethan set down his coffee cup. "I told you about my sister Mary, about how she died because no one helped her. What I didn't tell you was that I knew. I knew her husband was hurting her. She'd show up with bruises and I'd believe whatever excuse she gave. I didn't want to see it because seeing it meant doing something about it. And doing something about it meant confronting a man I'd known my whole life." He paused, staring at his hands. "So I did nothing. Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself she'd leave if it got too bad. Told myself all the comfortable lies that let me sleep at night. And then she died, and I had to live with knowing I could have saved her if I'd just had the courage to act." Clara's throat felt tight. "You can't save everyone." "No, but I can save the people in front of me. And you were in front of me, Clara. You were right there in my kitchen getting hurt by a man who worked on my land. I wasn't going to ignore that. Not again. Not ever again. So this is about Mary. Not about me. It started being about Mary, but somewhere along the way it became about you too. About a woman who deserves better than what she got. About giving someone a chance I didn't give my sister. Clara turned back to the stove. The stew was bubbling, filling the kitchen with savory smells. I don't know how to repay you for this. You don't repay it. You just live. You just take the freedom you earned and do something with it. That's enough. The hands came in for dinner. They ate the way they always did, quick and focused, talking about the day's work and tomorrow's plans. But there was an ease in the room that hadn't been there before, a sense that the worst was over, that they'd weathered the storm and come out intact. After the meal, Clara washed dishes while the sky outside turned purple and then black. Stars appeared one by one, bright and cold and infinite. She was drying the last plate when she heard horses outside. Multiple horses, moving fast. Miguel appeared in the doorway, hand on his gun. Stay inside. What's happening? Don't know yet, but stay inside until I tell you it's safe. He disappeared. Clara moved to the window, heart hammering. Through the glass she could see torches in the yard, men on horseback, at least a dozen of them. And at the front, sitting tall in his saddle, was James. He'd brought a mob, people from town, men who worked in the saloon, men who ranched on the outskirts, men who believed wives belonged to their husbands and courts had no business interfering. They carried torches and rifles, and the kind of righteous anger that came from watching their way of life challenged. Ethan walked out to meet them. He was alone, no gun visible, just standing in the dirt with his hands loose at his sides. Clara couldn't hear what was said, but she saw James gesture angrily toward the house, saw the mob shift and mutter, saw Ethan shake his head and hold his ground. Then the ranch hands appeared. They came from the bunkhouse, from the barn, from the shadows at the edge of the torchlight. Miguel, Tommy, Marcus, John, Jacob, William. All of them armed. All of them positioned between the mob and the house. The numbers were about even now, 12 men on horses versus 6 men on foot. But the ranch hands had position and cover and the absolute certainty that they were protecting their own. The standoff lasted maybe 2 minutes, felt like hours. Then Sheriff Carson rode up with 2 deputies. He positioned himself between the 2 groups, hand resting casual on his gun. Clara couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw James arguing, saw Carson shaking his head firmly, saw the mob starting to look uncertain. Finally, reluctantly, they turned their horses and rode away. James went with them, but not before looking back at the house one last time. Even from this distance, Clara could feel the hatred in that look. Carson stayed behind, talked with Ethan for a few minutes, then rode off into the night. Ethan came back to the kitchen. He looked tired. What did he want? Clara asked. James. He wanted to burn my ranch down and take you back by force. The others just wanted to make a point about proper morality and knowing your place. And Carson stopped them? Carson reminded them that you have a court order protecting you, and that anyone who violated it would be arrested. Also mentioned that attacking my ranch would be treated as armed assault and dealt with accordingly. Ethan poured himself whiskey this time, not coffee. They backed down, for now. They'll come back. Maybe. But each time they do, they'll have less support. People get tired of fighting other people's battles, especially when those battles might get them arrested or killed. Clara sat down at the table. This is never going to end, is it? James is never going to let this go. He might, eventually. Once he realizes you're serious, that there's no scenario where you go back to him, he might move on. Find someone else to hurt. The casual cruelty of that statement hit Clara hard. I escaped and someone else will take my place. That's not your fault. Isn't it? If you'd stayed, you'd be dead eventually. And that wouldn't save anyone. It would just add one more woman to the list of casualties. I hate that you're right. Me too. Ethan finished his whiskey. Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. But tonight, just rest. Clara went up to her room and locked the door, sat on the bed and stared at the wall. She was free. She'd won in court. She had legal protection and armed men willing to defend her. But James was still out there, still angry, still convinced she belonged to him. And Clara was starting to realize that freedom wasn't a single moment, wasn't one judge's ruling or one dramatic confrontation. Freedom was going to be a fight she had to win every single day. The next morning, Clara woke to find a letter slid under her door. It was from Morrison. The official divorce papers had been filed and recorded. She was legally Clara Ann Whitlock no more. Just Clara Ann. 24 years old, employed, independent, and terrifyingly free. She read the letter 3 times, trying to make it feel real. At breakfast, Ethan made an announcement. Effective immediately, Clara is no longer just the ranch cook. She's a full partner in Cross Ranch. Equal stake, equal say, equal share of profits. The hands stared at him. Clara stared at him. What? She managed. You heard me. This ranch works because of the work we all put in. You've been putting in more than your share for months now, and you've earned more than wages. You've earned ownership. I don't have money to buy into a partnership. You don't need money. You need skill and commitment and the willingness to work. You've got all 3. The paperwork is being drawn up now. By the end of the week, you'll own half this ranch. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was offering. Why? She finally asked. Why would you do this? Because you need independence, real independence, not just freedom from James. You need your own money, your own property, your own standing in this territory. This gives you that. Makes you untouchable in ways that just being my employee never would. But your ranch becomes our ranch. And honestly, I could use the help. Running this place alone is exhausting. Having a partner who actually knows what she's doing, that's worth more than the money. Miguel cleared his throat. Boss, if I may, this is a good decision. Senora Clara has more than earned this. The other hands nodded agreement. Even Jacob grunted approval. Clara felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll help me build this place into something that lasts. Yes, Clara whispered. Then louder. Yes, I'll do it. Ethan grinned. Good. Now finish your breakfast. We've got a ranch to run. The paperwork was filed the following week. Clara signed documents that made her an equal owner of Cross Ranch. 800 acres of land, 100 head of cattle, the main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, and everything in between. She owned something. Actually owned it in her own name, with legal documents that said nobody could take it from her. The town reacted about as well as expected. Mrs. Sutton declared it proof of immorality. Reverend Matthews preached about the corruption of women who forgot their place. The bank manager suggested darkly that improper relationships were being rewarded, but there was nothing they could do about it. The law was clear. Women could own property in the territory. Clara had money from her wages. The partnership was legal and binding. Red Hollow could disapprove all it wanted, couldn't change the facts. James tried one more time about a month later. Showed up at the property line, exactly 100 yards away, respecting the restraining order, and called out for Clara. She walked out to meet him. Didn't cross the boundary, didn't get close. Just stood there on her land, on her ranch, and looked at him across the distance. What do you want, James? He looked terrible. Thin, unshaven, clothes dirty, like he'd been drinking and not eating and generally falling apart. I want to talk, just talk. Please, Clara. We don't have anything to talk about. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better. That's good. Do it somewhere else. Clara, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. If you'd just give me another chance. No. The word came out flat and final. No anger, no fear, just absolute certainty. James flinched like she'd slapped him. You can't mean that. After everything we went through, after everything you put me through, Clara corrected. I gave you 6 years, James. 6 years of chances. I'm done giving. You're really going to throw away our marriage over this? Over some rough patches? The marriage is already gone. Has been for a month. And they weren't rough patches. They were years of abuse. Stop trying to rewrite history. I loved you. No, you loved owning me. There's a difference. James's face crumpled. For a moment he looked almost human. Almost like the man she'd married, who'd smiled and made promises and seemed capable of gentleness. But Clara had learned not to trust that face. I'm leaving Red Hollow, James said. Going to try my luck in Montana. Thought you should know. All right. That's it? Just all right? What do you want me to say? Good luck? I hope you find what you're looking for. I don't wish you well, James. I don't wish you anything. I just want you to go and stay gone. James stared at her for a long moment. Then he climbed on his horse and rode away. Clara watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she went back to work. She didn't tell Ethan about the conversation, didn't mention it to anyone, just filed it away as one more thing that was over and done. 3 days later, Sheriff Carson confirmed that James had left town, bought a ticket on the stage heading north and hadn't been seen since. He was gone, really gone, and Clara could finally breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. The ranch prospered over the next year. Clara and Ethan worked well together. She handled the household accounts and supply management. He handled the cattle and land. They made decisions jointly, argued about strategy, and built something that actually worked. The hands respected her, not because she was the boss's woman or his charity case, but because she'd proven herself capable and fair and willing to work as hard as anyone. Red Hollow stayed hostile, but their hostility became less relevant. Clara and Ethan did business in the next county over, found new suppliers, new buyers, new connections, built a reputation that wasn't based on gossip or scandal, but on honest work and fair dealing. Some people in Red Hollow came around eventually. The doctor's wife, who'd been cold for months, stopped by one day with a basket of preserves and an awkward apology. A few of the ranchers who'd worked with James admitted privately that they'd known he was violent but hadn't known how to intervene. Clara accepted their apologies without fanfare. Didn't hold grudges, but didn't forget either. Just moved forward because that was all you could do. One evening in early spring, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset. The cattle were settled for the night, the hands were in the bunkhouse playing cards, and the ranch was quiet except for the wind in the cottonwoods. You ever think about leaving? Ethan asked. Starting fresh somewhere nobody knows your history? Sometimes, Clara admitted. But then I think about what I built here, what we built, and I don't want to leave that behind. Even with all the whispers and judgment? Even with that. Let them whisper. I know who I am now. That's enough. Ethan smiled. You've changed, you know, since that first morning when I saw you through the kitchen window. How? You're louder. Take up more space. Don't apologize for existing anymore. Clara considered that. I was dying before. Slowly, but dying. This life, this ranch, this freedom, it brought me back. You brought yourself back. I just gave you space to do it. You gave me more than space. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. Stood beside me when it would have been easier to look away. Well, you've more than repaid that. This ranch runs better with you here. Hell, my whole life runs better with you here. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. Ethan, I know what people think. No, they assume there's something between us beyond the partnership. He met her eyes. But I want you to know, I never expected anything from you, never saw you as anything but what you are, a woman who deserved help. I know that. Good, because somewhere along the way, my feelings got complicated, and I need you to know that doesn't change anything. You're still my partner, still free to make your own choices. If you want to stay here and build this ranch together, I'd be honored. If you want to take your share and start fresh somewhere else, I'll help you pack. And if you ever decided you wanted something more than a partnership, he stopped. Well, that'd be your choice too. Clara's heart was doing something irregular in her chest. She'd thought about this possibility more than once over the past year, thought about what it might mean to let someone close again, to trust someone with more than just business decisions. The idea terrified her, but it also felt possible in a way nothing had felt possible a year ago. I don't know if I'm ready for more, she said honestly. Don't know if I'll ever be ready. 6 years with James, that does damage that doesn't just heal because you got free. I know. But I'm not saying no either. I'm just saying not now, maybe not ever, but maybe someday. Someday is enough. Someday means there's a future to think about. That's more than we had a year ago. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting. The sky turned from gold to pink to purple, and the first stars appeared. Clara thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Invisible, terrified, convinced she deserved the violence she endured. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone Clara used to know but had outgrown. She thought about the courtroom, about standing in front of everyone and telling the truth, about the judge's gavel coming down and declaring her free. She thought about James riding away toward Montana, carrying his anger and his certainty that he'd been wronged. And she thought about this porch, this ranch, this life she'd built from nothing but determination and the help of people who believed she was worth saving. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. "For what?" "For seeing me. When everyone else looked right through me, you saw me. That mattered more than you know. You were hard to miss, even when you were trying to be invisible." Clara smiled. "I'm done being invisible." "Good. The world needs more women who take up space." They sat together as night fell completely. Inside the house, Clara's house, the lamps were lit and warm light spilled through the windows. The ranch hands' laughter drifted across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang to each other. Clara was 25 years old. She owned land, had money in her own name, made her own decisions. She'd stood up to a man who thought he owned her and won. She'd faced down a whole town's disapproval and survived. She wasn't the woman she'd been. Wasn't even the woman she'd thought she'd become. She was something better, something earned, not given, something built from ruins and refusal to stay down. She was free. And this time, nobody could take that away. 2 years later, Clara stood in the same courtroom where she'd won her divorce. But this time she was there for different papers. Business documents expanding Cross Ranch into new territories. Legal agreements that made her one of the largest landowners in the county. Judge Blackwell signed the documents with the same careful precision he'd used on her divorce decree. "Mrs. He paused. "Forgive me. Miss Clara, you've done well for yourself." "Thank you, Your Honor. I remember when you stood in this courtroom asking for your freedom. Wasn't sure you'd survive what came after, if I'm being honest. Most women don't. Most women don't have the support I had. Perhaps. But support only goes so far. The rest was you, your courage, your refusal to accept less than you deserved." He handed her the signed documents. "Keep fighting. The territory needs more women like you." Clara left the courthouse and found Ethan waiting with the wagon. They'd come to town together, partners in every sense that mattered. The whispers had mostly died down. People had bigger scandals to talk about, newer controversies to dissect. Clara and Ethan were old news, just two people running a successful ranch, making an honest living. Red Hollow had a new reverend who preached about charity and understanding instead of submission. Mrs. Sutton had moved to her daughter's house in the territorial capital. The bank manager had retired. The town was changing, slowly, in ways that might eventually make it safer for the next woman who needed to escape. Clara hoped so anyway. They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence. The land spread out around them, their land, legally and completely. 800 acres had grown to 1,200. The herd had doubled. They'd built a new barn and expanded the bunkhouse. The ranch hands now numbered 20. Miguel had become foreman officially, with a salary that reflected his value. Tommy had married a girl from the next county and built a small house on the property. Even old Jacob seemed content, spending his evenings whittling and telling stories to the younger hands. It was a good life, not perfect. Nothing ever was. But good, honest, built on work and mutual respect and the radical notion that people deserve dignity. As they approached the ranch, Clara saw someone waiting by the gate. A woman, maybe 30, with a bruise on her face and a desperate expression. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I heard—" The woman's voice shook. "I heard that you helped a woman leave her husband, that you gave her work and protection and didn't ask questions." Clara climbed down from the wagon, approached the woman slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. My husband, he works in town. He's—" She touched the bruise on her face. "I need help. I need somewhere safe." Clara looked at Ethan. He nodded. "Come with us," Clara said. "We'll figure it out. You're safe now." Sarah started crying. Relief and fear and hope all mixed together. Clara understood that feeling, remembered it viscerally, the terror of asking for help, the fragile hope that someone might actually offer it. She put an arm around Sarah's shoulders and guided her toward the ranch, toward the house with rooms that locked, toward a kitchen where invisible women learned to take up space, toward the beginning of a different life. Because that's what freedom meant. Not just saving yourself, but reaching back for the next person. Not just surviving, but showing others how to survive. Clara had walked through fire and come out stronger, had stood alone when the whole world said she was wrong, had claimed a life nobody thought she deserved, and now she'd help Sarah do the same. The ranch gates opened before them. Clara walked through with her head up and her shoulders back, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. She'd been invisible once, been property, been told she was worthless and believed it, but she'd learned different, had proven different. She was Clara, landowner, business partner, survivor, free woman, and she'd be damned if she'd ever forget it again. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that promised tomorrow. The ranch settled into evening rhythms. Horses whinnied in the corral. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Somewhere, someone was playing a guitar. Clara stood on her porch, on her land, in her life, and smiled. She'd walked out of that courthouse 2 years ago uncertain and terrified, had won her freedom without knowing what to do with it. Now she knew. Freedom wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, a chance to build something worth keeping, a chance to help others find their own way out of the dark. She hadn't just escaped her past, she'd built a future, had proven that a woman with nothing could become a woman with everything that mattered. Not because someone gave it to her, not because she got lucky, but because she fought for it, stood up for it, refused to accept anything less. That was the story she'd tell someday, not about the abuse or the fear or the years wasted in survival mode, but about the moment she decided she was worth saving, about the choice to stand up even when standing up felt impossible, about a life lived not in silence but in defiant, beautiful, hard-won freedom. And it would be a story worth telling.